So this is part B. There is a indication saying that it is part BB. It's actually effectively B, but there was a confusion in the earlier edition. So instead of putting A, we put B. So that's why it is described as part BB. This is the continuation of the world exclusive diagnosis of Fleet Street. That is to say, the newspapers that are collectively known as or referred to as Fleet Street. And those newspapers, of course, include titles like this one, The Times, and The Guardian, which is referred to in the piece on page 23 of today's Times. And it says that bosses, well, these two bosses are at war over the Guardian's future. Now, this is the second week of the absolute genocidal attack or attacks on the Palestinians that has been going on, that have been going on. Attack has been going on, attacks have been going on. And there has been no condemnation of the attacks, the genocidal attacks, massacres, and murders of children. No condemnation has been made by Western kind of powers and sources. And the United Nations organization has got agencies like UNESCO and other agencies that are making token and tokenistic references to, well, the UNESCO release today has been referring to the 10 years, the last 10 years, during which journalists have been murdered or killed. Well, the word that the UNESCO is using is killed, not murdered. But they, of course, have been murdered. And the fact that the United Nations, UNESCO, is talking about journalists being killed, and the UNESCO is not talking about Palestinian children being killed and murdered, is more than significant. The United Nations, which was founded in the 1940s after the end of the Second European War, was founded, according to the founding statements on the record, to prevent the repeat of the kind of atrocities that the Second European War caused and created. So it would be reasonable to expect, or it would have been reasonable to have expected the United Nations to have done everything to live up to the founding aims and purposes over the decades since it was founded. Any kind of evidential look at the role and the behavior and the conduct of the United Nations would show that the United Nations has not lived up to and delivered that aim and purpose. As to why that has been so is, of course, a matter that can be only explained, described over many, many hours. for the purpose of this particular edition of the Khoodeelaar television channel online, the summary is that if you collect together all the atrocities and violence and massacres and genocides that have taken place and are taking place right across the world, but not as much in Western Europe as they are taking place in Asia and Africa. Mostly in Asia, mostly in Asia. And the reason would be, if we look at the kind of description, the linguistic kind of care being taken by, say for example, a Sikh man, S-I-K-H, a Sikh man praising the only turban Sikh MP, Tanmanjit Desi, in a tweet that we noticed today. He refers to the area where Palestine is at West Asia. West Asia is a phrase that is in denial. That is phrased in denial, not only in denial casually, but it's a denial motivated by and based on clear anti-Muslim hostility and denial. And that is a phrase that has long been used by and circulated by the mainstream Indian media. They don't refer to Palestine, they don't refer to the Middle East, they call it West Asia. That is a hostile description. Now, given the statements by the UNESCO about the children being murdered, that particular tweet, praiser of Tanmanjit Desi, does not show any particular concern for the fact that any child is being murdered, let alone the thousands being murdered, thousands of Palestinian children being murdered. And this is not just confined to the Indian kind of mainstream, which is linked with the narrative, linked with the agenda, linked with the policy of denying equal rights, human rights to Muslims. And as it was evident, as was witnessed in the immediate kind of aftermath, Narendra Modi, the man who has unleashed murderous surge of the virus against Indians under the pretense that he is the patriot. He is the patriot that is protecting Indians' lives. He is massacring Indians' lives. And there is no outrage. I mean, there has been nothing like the massacres of Indians ever in the known, accessible 1,000 years. And that's what is happening now. And only because he says that he is a Hindutva upholder, his massacre of the Hindutva people is being treated as not worth being outraged against. What else do they need? How much worse does Modi have to get before they see him as the evil that he is? He has nothing to do with the protection of the lives of Hindus and Brahmins. He's murdering them. What do they need? During the 700 years of the overly hated Muslim kind of domination and occupation in the subcontinent, nothing like this happened, nothing like this scale. An impunity of murdering Hindus took place. So what is happening in the kind of reluctance on the part of Joe Biden in the post in White House, and what is happening with the tweeting by this man, the Sikh man, more concerned about the turban of the MP than about the plight of the targets of the genocide, the targets of children, women, and elderly, and other people, all innocent, being massacred. It is the continuation of the agenda and the narrative that resembles in contemporary form the agenda and the narrative of the crusade. So read up on the crusade and you will find the details. You don't need to get the details from this particular program or this channel whatsoever. Crusade is something that is described very extensively, although all of the descriptions do not necessarily include all the truth, the main truth of the motivation behind the crusade. That is the only way that can be used to describe what is happening in terms of the response by the United Nations and the so-called world bodies and independent observers. We have already posted today that when the 1980s president of the USA, Ronald Reagan, actually denounced the United Nations UNESCO agency. He did that by following the agenda of the far right. He wasn't necessarily actually a member of the far right ideological movement, but he was on that occasion and in similar occasions when he was denouncing Iran, he was denouncing North Korea as the loons, the Looney Tunes. He was calling North Korea and Iran the Looney Tunes. And he was equally denouncing others. He was kind of targeting for narrative in the same way as the far right had done. He was actually, Ronald Reagan, using the agenda of the crusade. And the Crusaders' agenda that Ronald Reagan was using has never ceased to be an active operating agenda for most of the so-called West. And the Crusaders' agenda narrative has dominated the practice of most of the United Nations. As is evident in the contents of the UNESCO release that was released today, Wednesday, the 19th of May, 2021. Now, if the Crusaders' narrative and the Crusaders' agenda is clear to us in all the behavior of the United Nations agencies, including the United Nations permanent bureaucracies, how is it that this same evidence is not available to others or visible to others or recognizable to other observers. It is not conceivable. It is clear to the others, not in the same way that maybe we see the Crusaders' agenda, but more or less they can see the tracing back to the days of the crusade through the activities that are focused on violating Muslims' human rights across the Middle East and across the world. By the world, we include the Muslims being persecuted in China, not only in Uyghur, but in China, which is a big demography. There are other regions where Muslims are kind of majority in terms of numbers, and they're focused. The Chinese attacks on Muslims are based on the numerical majority of the Muslims in the particular target areas. Again, China has got particular kind of strategic links with Pakistan, which is a Muslim majority country. But the Pakistan regimes don't make any accessible, known, publicly accessible comments in solidarity with the Muslim victims of Chinese genocidal attacks and murders, which is very significant, which is significant as evidence of the fact, it is not some fantasy, it is fact, that Muslim majority countries and Muslim kind of holders of public office in various countries across the world are aware of the violations and the massacres and the genocide and genocidal attacks on Muslims going on right now. And there is no outrage, there is no evidence. There is no evidence, even as accessed today, Wednesday, the 19th of May 2021, that a single Muslim so-called head of state or representative, de facto representative, or effective representative of any government has pointed out this fact, let alone opposed it. And the role of the career diplomats posted by various countries as part of the United Nations membership of these countries, there is no movement, there is no sign, there is no evidence that the Muslim careerists or Muslim named careerists at and through and via the United Nations organization and its agencies are concerned or expressing concern, let alone doing something to stop the massacres of Muslim children, Muslim women, and Muslim men and others. And all of this is accessible. All these facts that I'm summarizing, these facts are accessible. These are available. These can be verified by sources carrying the evidence, the facts that I'm summarizing on literally hundreds of websites and internet platforms. And there is nothing in the accessible sites that I have checked today or can be checked now that shows any statement by any British political leader. And none of the Muslim organizations, so-called based in the Western countries across the world, is making a significant or noticeable, constitutionally legal and valid stance to stop the massacres of the Palestinians or the massacres of other Muslims in other parts of the world. The Palestinians are the ones that are receiving the worst attacks in the last 2 weeks. And there is nothing that is mentionable as the truth or as the recognition of the truth of what is going on that has been issued or may have been issued by the so-called left in Britain. The left that includes the likes of George Galloway. Now, Galloway has featured in a video that has been fronted by Michael Crick, who used to be a Channel 4 political reporter and before that a Newsnight political reporter. So we have seen the video containing George Galloway today. Now, Galloway's comments and the piece that Michael Crick has fronted today are about the coming by-election at the seat in Batley, West Yorkshire. Now, Batley is the seat that was represented by Joe Cox, who was murdered by a racist. But Michael Crick doesn't call him a racist. Michael Crick described Joe Cox's murderer as a fascist right-winger. But he was actually a racist, anti-Muslim murderer. And the short clip that, or the short statement that Galloway was given in the video that Michael Crick is fronting, and it is probably published by the Daily Mail Group. So Michael Crick is working, at least on this occasion, and around the by-election that is about to happen, with the Daily Mail. And in the statement that Galloway made, Galloway didn't refer to the Palestinians, and it didn't refer to the actual rights of the Palestinians, and he most certainly didn't refer to racism, anti-Muslim, murderous agenda, and most certainly not the very old and traditional mission that we have been talking about. The mission is that the Crusaders have been targeting Muslims for thousands of years, well, at least more than 1,000 years. Islam is only 1,500 years, just about old. So the Crusaders' agenda is in fact denied by George Galloway. And George Galloway has confessed to a list of errors or wrong things that the Keir Starmer fronted Labour Party is doing. Now that list is contradictory and factually confused and is totally racist and is completely devoid of any references to the massacres that are taking place of the Palestinians right now. So Galloway has made a career of exploiting the feeling that Muslims have in Britain in some constituencies of being treated by the mainstream parties which are following the Crusader agenda. But Galloway has never truthfully stated his stance on the crusade. And yet he goes and grabs hold of a constituency that he thinks vulnerable to his propaganda and his pretense, as happened in the case of the by-election in Bradford West, as well as in the general election in 2005, in which the constituents in Bethnal Green and Bow the constituency had significant Muslim numbers, rejected Una King as the then current MP and made it possible for Galloway to get elected because of the difference of numbers of votes that was created by the Muslims' rejection of Una King. I'm saying that the people didn't vote George Galloway, they voted Una King out. And the gap that was created simultaneously was grabbed hold of by George Galloway. And he was pretending to be a friend of the Muslims. Galloway has never been essentially a friend of the Muslims. Galloway has been essentially a grabber of votes. And this occasion in 2005 and in the by-election in Bradford West in 2012, both of those occasions, he exploited cynically and knowingly, he exploited the grievance of the Muslim electors in the given electorate and got himself elected a member of parliament. Once he got elected member of parliament, Galloway failed, absolutely abysmally failed, and demonstrably failed. That is to say, we can cite chapter and verse of Galloway's contemptuous failure and betrayal of the Muslim electors, whom he had given the promise. We didn't expect him to deliver, but he was the one who had given the promise. Okay, so this is part B. So what we shall be doing, we shall be finishing it here. And in the next edition, within the next few hours, we shall be covering on the remainder of the issues, including looking in an update on the behavior of the Guardian of the 200 years. As an update, we shall be looking at the piece that the Times carries about the row between the bosses at war over Guardian's future. This is the one that they're talking about on page 23 of the Guardian.